Okay, Kaiser to Council, Part 1. This is the beginning of the new video, little mini series that I'm going to do. In this first video, we're going to talk about the Julio-Claudian dynasty, looking at 44 BC to 8068. The reason for this little coverage, as we'll see, is kind of just the snippet within this. We're doing a video series looking at the assassination of Julius Caesar on March 15th, 44 BC, until the Second Council of Nicaea in 787. Now, the reason for this limitation is that's kind of where I'm fitting the patristic period in. Now, going back to Julius Caesar and this first video until Nero's suicide, thus bringing an end to the Julio-Claudian dynasty. The reason I'm looking at this period is because it's significant for considering the birth of the church. Now, this was what was setting up for the Imperial Rome. The assassination of Julius Caesar was a linchpin or a catalyst moment in the period of the fall of the Roman Republic. And we're going to talk about the Republic in just a second. But first, I want to give this little overview here. Why is this period important? Well, within this period that we're going to cover, we have the birth of Christ comes in the middle of this period, as well as the execution of Paul under the reign of Nero. And then also, why am I going so far back to 44 BC? Because you might be saying, Nathan, Jesus wasn't born until 5 BC. Why are we going back almost 40 years before that? Why is that important? Well, even consider John the Baptist's parents. When John the Baptist was born just a few months before Christ, they were very old. Now, they were a lot older than 40 years old, so their birth would have happened even much before this. Now, my point is that there's a lot of this overlap, and doing this series, I'm not really focusing in on the biblical events or the church events per se. I'm going to look at the more broad events that kind of provide the cultural and historical context for the birth of the church and how the church was developing as we get into the patristics, and why, so that when we talk about various figures, we can kind of have an idea in the back of our head of what's going on. So just to start, a brief little overview of the Roman Republic that was coming to a collapse for this period. So Rome was originally founded as a monarchy, but then it quickly deteriorated and the people revolted and set up a democracy somewhere around the 5th or 6th centuries BC. To give you a context, the Israelite exile kind of happened, give or take, around the time that Rome became a democratic republic. Each year they elected 2 consuls. Each consul had equal authority. Take that, Oscar from The Office, if you know the episode where he mocks the situation where Jim and Michael are set up as co-managers, and he says, "Where would Rome be without the Caesars?" Well, before Rome was an empire, an imperial system, it was a democracy that elected 2 consuls, so 2 people at the top, equal power for 1 year. Each year there was a new election. But as per every democracy, eventually it will deteriorate and things get more complex as people don't feel that they are properly represented and things like this. And it becomes more complex, and eventually power starts to corrupt. People thirst for more power. Eventually, we come to this period that we're going to cover with Julius Caesar. So without further ado, let's talk about Julius Caesar. Julius Kaiser. He was not the first emperor, as might be commonly thought. Even myself, when I was younger, I kind of thought he was the first emperor, but nope, he was not. He really just was fitting in with the existing democracy. Well, I shouldn't say fitting in, he was pushing the limits, but it was still a democracy, and he was kind of finding the fine print that allowed him to do things that he did. And yes, he was pushing the agenda, but he never became an emperor. He never became king. He kind of, a lot of speculation is that he might have wanted to, even though at one point Mark Antony came up to him at a festival ready to put a crown on his head, and the crowd booed, and so Julius dramatically resisted the crown. And so making that show that, no, I'm not your king, I'm just in charge of everything. Yeah, he it was a bit of a wishy-washy thing, which of course led to the senators assassinating him on March 15th in 44 BC. And so then those conspirators who assassinated him were also then later hunted down by Octavian and Mark Antony and were executed. And so then right after that, Octavian, who was Julius's adopted son and heir. So remember, this doesn't mean that Octavian now is emperor, because Julius was not emperor either. Kaiser or Caesar was just his name. It was not a title. It wasn't a role or a status. His name was Julius Caesar, like mine is, Nathan Scott. So too, Octavian, even though he is the heir of Julius Caesar, does not mean he's now in charge. He's just another guy who inherited his estate. And so Octavian and Antony were then also at that time politically connected and politically active. And so then they form a triumvirate with a third person who quickly got knocked out. So not important to name him. Antony moves over to the Eastern Empire. Octavian sets himself up in the West, based out of Rome. Antony over in Palestine, which was newly associated with Rome at this point. It was not a long time, like it wasn't very long ago. It was within Antony's lifetime that Palestine had now become part of Rome. So it was still very new. Like even Elizabeth and Zacharias, John the Baptist's parents, would possibly have remembered a time when Rome was not in charge of Israel. So Antony then moves down to Egypt and starts his major fling with, you guessed it, Queen Cleopatra of Egypt. Now, Egypt was independent from Rome at this point. Rome did not control Egypt. Egypt was its own political entity, separate from the control of Rome. And again, Rome is not an empire yet. Then there's just some things going up. Antony and Cleopatra start a bit of sedition. Octavian is desecrating Antony's name over in Rome. They sail out to meet in Actium in Greece with a major naval battle. In the year 31 BC, Antony and Cleopatra lose and flee back to Egypt. 30 BC, Octavian goes down, takes over. Antony and Cleopatra are now dead. Octavian comes back to Rome, a conquering hero, although he's conquered another Roman, but he's now annexed Egypt to be a part of Rome, so there's something to celebrate. But now he is in 27 BC. Octavian is set up as princeps. That title means just first man, or the primary senator, or kind of like the oldest senator, even though Octavian himself was only in his 20s at this time. So he now is princeps, not emperor. Even the word emperor comes from the Latin word imperator, which just means general. The imperator was just the guy who led troops into battle. So nothing super world dominating about imperator either. So again, this princeps now, he's now set up as princeps for life, which he's allowed this title because he's on the Senate now. Technically, I guess, on paper, which allows the Roman government to still function as a bit of a pseudo-democracy. They still kept electing consuls every year, for example. But Octavian then kind of held this power as in this pseudo-democracy for 40 years, and then he died in the year AD 14. And so by the time he died, most people, wouldn't have really had a whole memory of an actual democracy. And so we kind of just continue on with things. And so his adopted heir, his stepson Tiberius, now takes the throne. And then 23 years later, after a bit of a paranoid and odd and bit of a tyrannical rule, Tiberius retires to a villa while he's in his 70s. And then when he was 77 in the year 37 AD, Tiberius died. Now, also to note, 14 AD to 37, that's the time when Jesus was doing his ministry. So it was during the reign of Tiberius that Jesus was ministering in Israel. Tiberius was succeeded by his great nephew Gaius. Now, Gaius, you might not know that name, but you probably might know the name Caligula. Caligula is actually a fun Latin word that just means little booties. Yes, Caligula, as a little child, would have gone off to the war with his family on their military escapades and would have been just like a child pretending to be a soldier with his stuff, and I guess he had some cute booties, and so the soldiers took to calling him Little Caligula. Well, Caligula is a Latin suffix which just means little, so Little Booties is kind of his name, and he's been remembered by that, maybe as a way to mock him because he was a bit of an odd emperor, and that's quite a compliment. He made a horse a senator, and that same horse later made him into a consul and tried to kind of kill off his family. And there's a lot more weird, messed up stuff he did. Fun to read. So then, Caligula was stabbed to death by his own personal bodyguard in January of AD 41. And Uncle Claudius, the stutterer, the weirdo that you might be familiar with from the series I, Claudius, or the book by Robert Graves, Claudius takes the throne, and Claudius is mentioned twice in the book of Acts, Acts 11:28 and 18:2. Another Roman historian talks about the event from Acts 18:2. He says this, quote, "Because the Jews at Rome caused continuous disturbances at the instigation of Christus, he expelled them from the city." Who's this Christus, you ask? Probably, yes, Jesus Christ. Now, also because the church was really small, not really much of a significant thing, there was probably misunderstandings, and Suetonius, even him writing in the early 2nd century or mid-2nd century, not really fully understanding what this church is all about. It's a Christus because he had heard Christus, it's whatever, Christus. Claudius dies in October AD 54, and he is succeeded by his stepson. No, his great-nephew. No, it's his stepson. No, it's his... Claudius married his niece, and so then his stepson Nero takes the throne. So, yes, family marriages. Step aside, Jeff Foxworthy, with your rednecks. If you attend family gatherings to pick up chicks, you might be a Julio-Claudian. During Nero's reign, Seneca was his advisor. Seneca is known as a famous Stoic philosopher. Also, it's interesting to note that Seneca and Paul possibly had some letters that they mailed back and forth. Peter and Paul were both executed under Nero, and Nero had some really fun things too. It seems like maybe he was trying to compete with Caligula. Who can be weirder? So Nero had his wife, after she died, had her stuffed and put in his mausoleum, and apparently the same thing with his mother. Yeah, a little side project, it's worth it. Read up on the story of how Nero killed his mother, Agrippina. It's fun and weird. But a side thing, when you think about Nero and Caligula, why were they so messed up? Well, you try handing world-dominating absolute power to a teenager and find out what happens. So, in 68 AD, Servius Sulpicius Galba is rallied by his troops in Spain and declared imperator. So Galba was a governor in Spain, and he then decides to march against Rome to take over power. Nero hears about this on the anniversary of his mother's death. He flees and kills himself, thus bringing an end to the Julio-Claudian dynasty. And so join us next time, and we'll talk about the year of the 4 emperors, the Flavian dynasty, and the 5 good emperors. Before we go, just a quick note on a bit of a cultural thing that's very relevant to the development of the church, is this notion of deification. Now, especially even with these first few emperors, we had 3 of them that were deified. Now, what does that even mean? You might have heard that the emperors were worshipped like gods. That's only half true. Yes, a lot of temples were built to the emperors, but this was only post-mortem. An emperor did not become a god until after he died. Now also, this wasn't every emperor. Tiberius, Caligula, and Nero were not deified. The only of the Julio-Claudians, it was Julius, Augustus, and Claudius. They were the only ones that were deified. So deification was something that happened later when the next emperor took power with the approval of the Senate. It's important, the Senate had to approve this. The emperor didn't quite have as much power as we tend to think he did. So the Senate and the emperor decide to deify the previous emperor, and so then now the existing ruling emperor becomes what is able to then call himself Son of God. Now let that set with you and think how that's important for how we understand the development of the church and that cultural context. And so I'll leave you with some lines from a poem by an early Roman poet named Ovid in his great epic, The Metamorphoses. And this is what he says in his poem about Julius Caesar and his deification. Kaiser is a god in his own city, raised to heaven, changed into a star, blazing so brilliantly. No deed has Caesar done that stands out more than this. He is the father of our own Augustus. That such a man might not be born mortal, his father must be made into a god. Thank you, and I will talk to you later.